All right, thank you for enduring another session. This one's going to be on something that I don't think too many people have paid a lot of attention to, but as more and more people become interested, it has become more and more important, and that is honoring privacy among obese youth and also looking at stigma. And you will find that this presentation is going to be much more interactive, I'm sure, than you thought, because there's a lot of observational information, but the solutions are somewhat vague, and that's where you all are going to become important. I don't know, can you hear questions that they ask from, or I'll repeat them so we'll know what they are, so we'll keep that aware. What if, and this is the environment in which we've put our children into. They're in an environment where there are fewer physical activity facilities. There are more than ever before fast food restaurants, fewer grocery stores, and poor food placement in stores. By that I mean we're all familiar with the aisle of terror. When you go to the grocery store and you're checking out, all the bad things are at arm's reach for the children. That's done on purpose because they know you're in line, they know you only have a few minutes, they know you're anxious to get out, and they know if your child starts pouring stuff into the basket, you can either make a scene and put it back, or more than likely you're going to say, okay. So we've got all these things working against us. And children, as a matter of fact, especially young kids, have very little control over their obesogenic environment. Obviously, as they get older, they make their own choices. But when they're very young, they're the product of their environment. So the first question I would ask you to think about is, do children have any responsibility? And if so, what choices have we given them to exercise that responsibility? For example, if mother offers a bowl of fresh fruit and a bowl of potato chips and says, you can go have a snack, that child may make the bad choice and choose potato chips because we gave them that opportunity. And mom or dad will invariably say, I want my child to learn how to make the correct choice. And therefore, I'm giving them a choice, and I'm not responsible for what they choose. My not so obvious response to that is, Mom, next time give them a bowl of fruit, a bowl of potato chips, and a bowl of cocaine. And say, let them make a choice. Now, Mom's going to say, well, I can't let them choose coke. I hope she would say, let's not let them choose cocaine. And then I point out, well, there's not much difference, really, in the health of that child if you're offering them bad food all the time as a choice. So we do have to worry about what choices, and I would prefer that mother or father give that child 2 choices of fresh fruit and no potato chips. So still, they can exercise their choice. So keep that in mind. Well, what about weight bias, and what does that mean? Well, weight bias is allowed in our society, and these are suppositions, but allowed in this society because stigma and shame will motivate people to lose weight. How many times have we heard in a conversation somebody who's very obese walks by and someone says, I don't know how they let them be that way, or they don't control themselves, or they may have a large drink and you say, see, that's how they got the way they are. So society believes if we make fun and or ostracize these individuals, they'll change their behavior. And also people believe, widely held, that most people are obese because they have poor self-discipline, they make poor choices, and it's their own fault. Lack willpower. Weight bias is also allowed because our culture sanctions it. It values thinness. If you don't believe that, we'll talk a little bit about the media in a minute, but pick up any magazine, any popular magazine in the grocery store, and it does not glorify or even portray what the average American looks like. There have been lots of articles recently about models in Cosmopolitan and other magazines where they really, really are thin, and that is valued. We often, as a society, blame the victim. The obese child or the obese parent is that way because they choose to be that way, and we allow bias in the media. So that's why we think weight bias is so prevalent. Now we also know, and you heard a little bit about this morning, weight bias will increase depression. Kids who are obese are more likely to be depressed and suicidal than any other group. They're very anxious. They have very low self-esteem. We talked in one of the other breakout sessions that if you take obese, particularly girls, they somehow miss that lecture on how to use makeup. They miss that lecture on how to dress appropriately. They miss that lecture on social graces. Why is that? Well, we've kind of channeled them into that. So they have low self-esteem, and with that goes poor body image. They're suicidal, and they have suicidal thoughts. They really are defeatists in their attitudes. And interestingly, in the studies that have looked at such behavior, they tend to eat more when all of those things become prevalent. So you have an obese child who suffers from all these things, and then they tend to eat more because that's a release. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Most people don't understand that. We just say stop eating as if that's the only thing they can do. Weight bias has been associated with teasing. Now this sounds self-evident, but the teasing varies among different groups. Anybody who's listened to popular rap music, some popular rap music glorifies large women. And so there are certain groups in our society that do not want to lose weight. And so this becomes very obvious when you go to a group of certain, not all black women, as I said this morning, but you go to some black women where if they lose weight, they're actually ostracized out of their society. So if you have a girl like that and you go and say, don't you want to lose weight to look like that model in Cosmopolitan, nothing is further from the truth. So you have to decide what's going to motivate that girl to lose weight. And it might be that her grand aunt died from diabetes, or her mother has diabetes and has to take insulin. And instead of saying, don't you want to lose weight so you can look like all these other girls? No. Do you want to lose weight so that you don't get diabetes? See, that's a different message altogether. We have to understand how peers view this. As we said earlier today, people who are overweight tend to travel with other people who are overweight. So it's better to get the whole group to realize this is a problem rather than one person who you're asking to give up their social structure. We learned that very early with cigarette and tobacco use. If you say to someone, stop smoking because it's bad for you, you probably won't get very far. If you ask why you're smoking, you say, well, all my friends smoke. Then you can begin to understand this is a culture of that group, whatever group it is. So you can do the same thing with weight. And then you have to understand, as I said earlier, various groups have different attitudes about being overweight. Asian Americans are not as concerned as Caucasian Americans, for example. Well, it may surprise you to learn that in studies that have looked at this recently, that racial bias and discrimination is almost as prevalent as racial bias in this country. That's a powerful statement. It is also true in studies that have looked at such behavior that racial bias has been pretty flat over the last several years, but weight bias has increased over the last several years. So that's really important. And why is that? Well, pick up any television show you care to look at, except what's the one where the couple is dating each other? Mike and Molly. Mike and Molly. Okay, how do you know? No, I'm just kidding. Mike and Molly is the only television show on prime time that talks about weight. And they do it in a negative fashion. If you've ever watched Mike and Molly, they're always eating and making fun of themselves as being overweight. They don't talk about the healthy things they could be doing, etc. So even that story is making fun of people who are overweight. But outside of that, look at any popular game show, look at any of the reality shows, look at all that stuff. They do not have very obese people. They're all very thin and kind of the ideal weight. So the media does portray that. Also the diet industry. I could make $1 billion if I had $1 for every commercial that looks at the easy way to lose weight. You know, you got this gimmick, this food, that food. So it's all perpetuating this problem. So I have these questions for you, and I don't expect you to answer all of them, but I expect you to think about each and every one of them. Is this a rights violation? Are we violating obese individuals' rights by bringing this stuff up? Do we have, I take the airplane seat for example. Is it a violation of the obese person's right to be able to sit in that airplane seat plus everybody on either side, take up all of that space, or is it a right to let those people pay for a double seat because they're taking up a double seat? Society certainly is wrestling with that, but that's a question that we have to look at. New York City, bless their heart, are bringing up these other two things. Is it appropriate for a city to say, thou shalt not order a very large soft drink? It's illegal to do so. Is that right? Is that not right? Don't know the answer to that. Can we ban bad foods? Can we tax foods? Can we tax sweetened beverages? Can we tax certain snacks in order to get people to change their behavior? Is that a violation of their rights? We don't tax people for eating healthy food. So do we have the right to tax people for eating unhealthy food? Again, I don't have an answer to, well, I have an opinion, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. But is that any different than saying if you smoke, you should pay more for health insurance than if you don't smoke? These are just questions that we do begin to ask. How about weight bias in the employment arena? And some of this stuff is fascinating. Most employers who have been surveyed, and they've been blinded so you don't know who they are, so they can be very honest, will say if they have two people, a lean person and an obese person, they believe that the obese person has poorer self-discipline and is less likely to hire them. Okay? We know that they believe that these individuals have less supervisory potential. So we don't want to hire those people because those people may not make good employees. There's a belief that obese people have poor hygiene. Now that may or may not be the case, but that's what people believe in these surveys. They have less ambition and less productivity. 43% of obese people report weight bias in the workplace. Fascinating that they earn less money just because of their weight, and they are promoted on a less frequent basis. So there is definite weight bias in the employment arena. What about discrimination? Overweight adults claim that they are discriminated against 12 times more than their lean counterparts. Obese adults, who are obviously larger than the overweight ones, say it's 37 times. And if you're severely morbidly obese, it's 100 times. So there really is discrimination and bias in the workplace. So it does exist. This is fascinating stuff. If you go to physicians, and again, ask them blindly so they can offer their answers honestly, they believe that obese patients are more lazy, they lack self-control, they're non-compliant with any medication or treatment plan you care to offer, they are unintelligent, they are weak-willed, and they are dishonest. These are things that health professionals, doctors, nurses, say about obese patients. Well, how then can they deliver care to these individuals in an unbiased manner? Now, I'm not saying all physicians are that way. I'm not saying most physicians are that way. What I am saying is that it is out there. So as we develop these tools and these treatment things and all this other stuff for obese individuals, we have to start with the person who's providing that service and make sure that they do not have these biases when they deliver their care. 33% of people surveyed in most of these surveys, about an average, 33% admit to these biases. So it's not a small amount of people. What's even more frightening, if you ask them to rank drug addiction and alcoholism and obesity, they're very close to each other. That means this 33% thinks that an obese person is just as bad as somebody who's addicted on drugs or who's an alcoholic. The reason that's frightening and fascinating is that if we're going to move this needle with health professionals, we need to recognize that we need to provide some counseling and information to health professionals before they start. Does that make sense? You understand that? Okay. It is also true that somebody who is obese feels that they are suffering as a part of the healthcare system and are reluctant to engage in the healthcare system. So, obese individuals as a whole are generally reluctant to seek medical attention until the symptoms become unbearable. That means if you have a lump on your breast or you have a pain in your side or whatever it happens to be, you're less likely to seek care right away because either you're embarrassed or you feel that you're going to be laughed at or people are going to snide at you. Whatever the reason, you're less likely to seek care. So you put off preventative services. And most weight-related issues do not want to be brought up by the individuals. In other words, they're not going to come in and say, you know, doc, my BMI is 45 and I want to lose weight. Those individuals exist, but they're not very common. And if you bring it up, as we said today, what is the key word? What is the code word you're going to use? Probably shouldn't use the word fat, obese, overweight. There are other ways you can introduce this, and some people are going to talk about motivational interviewing tomorrow. So if you have questions about that, be sure to attend that session. But there are ways to do it so that you can bring it up and get the same information without being offensive. It is also true but sad that doctors spend less time and are reluctant to do procedures, particularly invasive procedures, on obese individuals or to discuss weight-related issues. So there's a lot of bias in the healthcare arena as well. So, some questions that I'd like you to ponder. Should we have screening standards for BMI classes? We heard today Sandra mention that if you are in a certain weight class, you should have liver function studies done, you should have cholesterol measured, you should know what your fasting glucose, etc. is. Is that discrimination? Are we taking someone and we're discriminating against them and making them have these other studies? Now, I personally believe that's not true, but there are people who are saying we are stigmatizing these individuals by having them do those tests. Should counseling be required? That's probably the next thing that's going to happen in New York City. You know, they've gotten rid of sweetened drinks. They've put calories up on menus. They may say, you know, before you can get insurance or whatever, you need to be counseling. Is that ethical? Don't know. Would it help? Doubtful. But that's a question that begs to be asked. What about weight bias in education? We know that obese individuals miss more school. Now, it may not be a one-to-one relationship because if you have comorbidities, you have more asthma, you have sleep apnea, you don't feel as well or whatever, you may miss school on that account. But it is true that if you take all kids who miss school, there are more obese kids in that bucket than any other class. They are less likely to attend college for whatever reason, but they are as a group less likely to attend college. They avoid physical activity. This was an important one that we touched on briefly this morning. It is very unlikely that the obese child, male or female, is going to go into a gym class where they have to undress because people make fun of them. So they often will miss class or even miss school if gym is taught that day. We know that swimming is one of the best exercises for someone who's very obese because the water will neutralize their weight and they can do their exercise. However, they need to put on a swimsuit. If you put on a swimsuit, people are going to laugh at you. Therefore, yeah, doc, swimming is really good. Send me to the Y. Not a chance. So you've got to worry about that as well. Kids are very cruel. They tease their siblings. They tease their roommates. They tease their classmates. They tease their brothers and sisters. That has a devastating effect on one's self-esteem. That's why these kids are more depressed and more suicidal, as we talked about earlier. Teachers have an unhealthy view of kids who are obese. They think they're untidy, they're emotional, and believe it or not, they believe because they're obese, they come from a dysfunctional family. Now, I've met thousands of dysfunctional families through the years, and obesity is not the common denominator. I mean, there are a lot of dysfunctional families around. However, teachers often believe that just looking at the child. You're coming from a disheveled, dysfunctional, undisciplined family. 43% of teachers in high school and grade school are uncomfortable around an obese student. They have lower expectations because they think they are lazy, etc. 33% of females and 25% of males say they are teased in their school environment just because of their weight. Playmates view them as lazy, stupid, ugly, mean, and unhappy. So you don't choose them. Think about the days, you probably don't do this in your age, our age, we used to choose sides for games and so forth, and it was almost always the obese child who was not chosen till the very last. And that continues to today, and believe it or not, this starts in preschool. And you can actually see these cliques of kids. If you go and look at a playground, you'll see even the obese kids are tending to be around each other, and the thin kids are around somebody else, even in preschool. Physical educators are probably the worst. We often say kids ought to go to the Y or they ought to go into physical education. And Sandra said you've got to make sure that that's a healthy environment. She's absolutely correct, because if you're lucky enough to be in a school system that has certified PE teachers, most of those individuals are coaches. And most coaches believe obese kids are lazy and it's their own fault. So get up here, kid, and give me 20 or run that lap or do whatever it happens to be, because this is your fault and you can make it better. And that's the absolute worst thing you can do for an obese child. We mentioned in one of our breakouts, if you take these shy, retiring, obese kids who are not physically active and you put them in a class where everybody else is obese, they become very active all of a sudden, because they're like everybody else, and they're going to have successes and failures like everybody else. Whereas if you put them in the President's Council for Physical Fitness and say run a mile, they know they're going to be dead last. They know everybody's going to laugh at them. They know everybody's going to be waiting on them. So that's a terrible thing to put them into doing. So just keep that in mind. And remember, putting them in that environment can do more harm than good. So you give them realistic goals, not unrealistic goals. So, should PE be required? If PE is required, should it be adaptable PE for their abilities? Okay? That's a question that you have to ponder. What if they refuse to go? What if you have President's Council and you say you got to run a mile, and this child says there's no way I can walk a mile, let alone run a mile. I don't want everybody laughing at me, therefore I'm not going to do it. What do we do with that? What about the coach or the teacher who demands this behavior, demands this activity, even though the child can't do it and they know that? Is it expected? If it's not expected, what should we expect them to do? And should we tailor these classes? You see, one of the school districts in Denver several years ago said, okay, having heard such a presentation, said we'll start a class for just obese kids. And we'll let them sign up for it privately so that they can go to this gym class in this particular area of the school. Well, unless you have some high degree of security, people are going to be looking, and this happened. They look in the window, they see all the obese kids, they make fun of them, and that really backfired. So you've got to have some privacy if you're going to do this. What about the media? Obese characters have minor roles except for Mike and Molly, and if you've never seen Mike and Molly, they always make fun of their obesity. They're always eating and making fun of their eating and so on. Anybody seen the show? None of you have seen the show? Isn't that true, though? They're always eating Twinkies and, doing all this stuff and making fun of each other, which is kind of healthy, but it isn't healthy at the same time. And then advertising, there's all kinds of advertisements about how easy it is to lose weight with no effort. Just give me your money. And I guarantee you'll lose weight with a money-back guarantee, but I'm not going to give you your money back because I'm going to make it so onerous for you to get to me to get my money back, you'll never try. But it's out there all the time, and then there are diets after diets after diets after diets. So the media promotes this. It's a problem, and we can fix it for you. Sad but true, parents are discriminatory against their own kids. Overweight and obese parents are just as likely as thin parents to endorse negative stereotypes of their sons and daughters. Obese kids say that 47% if you're a girl and 34% if you're a boy say that your parents were mean to you because of your weight. Interesting studies have shown that if you have two kids, one lean and one obese, you're more likely to give the lean one more attention and equally, if not more important, more money. Think about that. That's within the same family. And parents may feel guilty because of this obese child and do some reaction things that make the thing worse. So they pick on their obese children, they say it's brought upon themselves, or they say just let him or her eat and they'll be quiet. So it's a huge problem. So in summary, we can say weight bias is no big deal, or we can say it's very serious and pervasive. We can say decreased stigma means obesity is okay, or we need to educate everybody, doctors, medical people, teachers, that it is a problem. And some people believe criticism, if I tell you you're overweight and obese enough, you're going to change your behavior. Actually, the opposite is more likely to be true. What about bias in the law? We must protect the rights of adults and children in their conflicts. Do we have the right to tell kids in school, these are questions that people ask. Do we have the right to tell children in school that you can't have unhealthy snacks? So we take away their competitive foods. Is that a violation of their rights? Or should we do that only for adults? We tell adults they can choose the popcorn, not the popcorn, the Cheetos, the fruit, and the cocaine. But do we have a legal obligation not to offer the cocaine to children? Well, at what age do you make that decision? And on what legal basis do you do it? And parents will always storm down to the school and say, this nanny state cannot take away my ability to bring birthday cake for my child's birthday. If the school has a policy that no outside food can come in that exceeds the standards, parents will say, no, you don't have that right to limit what my child does. It's easier directed for advertising, i.e. you can take food advertisements away from programs that are geared to kids, but even there, do you have a legal right to do so, and where do you draw the line? Do you have the right to tax certain behaviors like soft drinks and use of generated funds to do other things? Do you have that right? Or is that discrimination in and of itself? The government could limit the amount of high fructose corn syrup, but do they have the right to do so? Some of us wish they would, but do you have the right to do so? Is that what we're all about in this country? And we have zoning laws that limit things like how close a liquor store can be to a school. Colorado, at least, we have laws of how close a marijuana store can be to a school. But you can have a dozen fast food restaurants in the driveway of the school. Is that right? Is that not right? Do we have the right to say anything about that? Don't know. What about even classifying kids by BMI? Is that discriminatory if we say, you know what, you're above the 85th percentile, so you're overweight, or you're above the 95th percentile, so we're going to label you as obese? In reality, that's no different than saying you're pre-hypertensive or hypertensive, or pre-diabetic or diabetic, but for some reason, this classification has caused a lot of angst among people. And then there are people who say we have no right to screen. We have no right to go into a school and weigh kids and send home their BMI report cards. So, when we wrote I guess it was 2 versions ago, when we changed, we meaning the committee I was serving on, changed the terminology for at risk for overweight and overweight. That was the previous terminology. We were not allowed to use the word obese. So is it at risk for overweight or overweight? When we changed it to overweight and obese, those recommendations took an extra 19 months to be approved because of that one change. Here's a document that probably 450, 500 pages long, and there was one sentence in one page that held it up for almost a year and a half. Why? Because people said you cannot call American children obese. And we had to go around and around and around about that. That's how sensitive people are about this. Keep in mind that BMI does not measure body fat. So I was on a talk show once, and somebody called in and said, I have a BMI of 35, and I'm an Olympic weightlifter, and you're telling me I'm obese. And I said to this guy, listen, you must think we're all idiots. If you take an Olympic weightlifter and strip him down and he's standing in front of me buck naked, and here's an obese individual with a BMI of 35, excuse me, sir, I think I could tell the difference, right? So he was hung up on we're calling this number obese rather than the person obese. And you've got to concede the point that BMI is a tool to determine if you're obese or not. It's not in and of itself the definition. So if your excess body mass is all muscle, okay, but 99% of the time your excess body mass is not all muscle, right? So we don't need to get hung up with that. Okay, there are various groups that have talked about this, and they argued about labeling children. If we call a child overweight, we're putting a stigma on them that's going to last for the rest of their life. My answer to that is obese and overweight are medical terms. They are not necessarily the terms you have to use with a patient. You have to figure out what is going to work with them. Is it, you know what, because of your health circumstance, I'm concerned you might be developing diabetes, or I'm concerned your blood pressure may be too high, or I'm concerned if you don't change this behavior, those kinds of things are going to happen. You don't have to bring up obese or overweight, but you can say you can lessen your chances of getting diabetes if you do the following things. And you can never even mention weight if that family isn't able to comprehend what you're going to say. You don't want to make them angry. You don't want to turn them away. Now, we don't do that, as I said earlier in a breakout session. If somebody has an elevation in their white blood cell count and their bone marrow is overrun with these white blood cells and they're not making red blood cells and they're anemic, we call that leukemia. Okay, we don't go to that child and say, you know, you have a very high white blood cell count and we're going to have to treat you with these special medicines to get your white blood cell count down. No, we say you have leukemia and we have chemotherapy to help your leukemia get better. But we have to be a little more ginger and respectful when we talk about obesity because of all these sensitivities. But I think we have to address the issue however we do so. So the question comes up, is BMI screening harmful? And is there harm created by sending home these BMI report cards? Well, we don't know. The charge or the possibility is that this BMI stigmatization will promote dieting. There are some studies to show that is true, but take comfort that the vast majority of studies demonstrate that that is not the fact. That is not actually happening. There are studies or people who say this will increase the bias and stigma in obese kids. And actually, if you do it confidentially, that doesn't happen as well. Lower self-esteem, again, it depends on what message you're delivering to the child, if that is in fact going to be a happen. And increased body dissatisfaction, that may occur. Disordered eating may occur, but actually in studies that have looked at this, and there are not 1,000 of them, believe me, but in the studies that have been performed, those things really do not happen. So if someone says to you, we're not going to measure BMI because we're going to turn everybody into anorexics, there's really no data to show that is true. Now, of course, anecdotally, there's one here or one there, but there's not an overwhelming possibility that this is going to happen. Arkansas was the first state to roll this out, and when they actually looked at this, they found that when they reported the BMI to parents, that obviously did not happen. Parents could opt out, most elected not to, and now many other states, far more than 6 when this slide was made, are sending BMIs home with their kids. The interesting thing about how Arkansas failed is that they didn't do the next step, which is, okay, so you get this report card and you send it home, and then mom or dad calls their health care provider and says, my child has a BMI of thus and such, and I want to do something to treat it. There was nothing there. That's where the void was. But there was really no stigma that any study that I'm aware of has shown was generated by that. So there's no increase in bias or eating disorders reported after 4 years of sending BMI measurements home for kids. Eating disorders. Remember, eating disorders are caused by a variety of things you see here, but there is no evidence that the recent attention has increased eating disorders. Now again, you may identify an anecdotal case, but you're not going to identify a lot of studies or even one study that shows that is true. Just a quick thing about making generalizations, and I talked about this morning. What makes up an obese child is due to a bunch of different factors, including their socioeconomic status and everything else you see on there. And I caution you about putting one kid in a big box like that. People have a desire to be thin, but not everybody has a desire to be thin. So don't pretend that just because you come in and say, boy, you're overweight, however you package that, you're going to motivate kids to lose weight. So a discussion question, what if there was no public will? What if nobody wanted to lose weight? What would you do with that? And what would you do if there is no opportunity to change? That is, nobody's going to allow you to change what is offered to kids in schools, etc. Those are questions. So we have an obligation to protect our kids. I don't know if a soda tax will do it. And I invite you to fight obesity, not obese people. And I believe that is about all. Many factors involved in weight. Be sensitive to the past and present experiences they may have had. Discuss the factors rather than weight alone, and don't forget about your own feelings and biases when you're counseling these children. That's it. Thank you very much, and on to your next session.